Investment, poverty alleviation and economic growth are South Africa's priorities at the G7 meeting in France this weekend. President Cyril Ramaphosa is attending the gathering of the world's most industrialized countries in Biarritz. Other African nations invited include Egypt, Rwanda, Burkina Faso and Senegal.
South Africa is a regular feature at G7 meetings. It's the second time President Ramaphosa is meeting colleagues from the richest countries in the world. He will use the platform to state South Africa's investment case. The country is struggling economically.
France, which holds the presidency of the G-Summit, has invited South Africa, amongst other major economies with regional influence, as well as other strategic African partners, to build a renewed partnership and form coalitions around projects and solutions to combat inequality more effectively. The working visit will also provide a platform for the president and accompanying members of cabinet to invite global partners to experience South Africa as an investment destination and a preferred trade partner.
While South Africa will hold several bilateral meetings, there's no doubt that the US-China trade battle will take center stage. And the new British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, an ally of President Donald Trump, will be making his first appearance.
You know who this is, as everybody knows? It's going to be a fantastic Prime Minister, I can tell you. And we're having very, very good meetings. So far, it's really good.
And we're going to do a fantastic deal once we clear up some of the obstacles in our path.
I think it's a fantastic many deals. Talking about many different deals, but we're having a good time. As far as UK and the United States, we're working on a very big trade deal, and I think it's going to work out very well.
But the host, French President Emmanuel Macron, will seek to de-escalate tensions on a number of issues. President Ramaphosa will hope his message is received favorably as he earnestly begins to address challenges facing the country in his first few months as a leader. As part of his investment drive, he travels from France to Tokyo for an Africa-Japan summit next week. Mzwandile Mbeje, SABC News.
Well, for the latest, we are joined by correspondent Elena Casas-Montanez. Hi, Elena. Things are hotting up where you are. What is the latest in terms of arrivals from Biarritz?
Well, as you may already have heard, we've had a surprise guest arrive this afternoon, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Now, the French Foreign Ministry invited him. They did inform the other delegations, they're saying, although President Donald Trump refused to comment on this earlier today, and the Iranians say they won't be meeting the American delegation. Iran was discussed by the 7 leaders over their first formal dinner last night, and they found it difficult to agree a joint position. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, who's been spearheading efforts to try and bring the Iran nuclear deal back on board, suggested a plan under which the Americans would alleviate some of their sanctions on Iranian oil. They would allow the Iranians to sell some oil, and in exchange for that, the Iranians would go back to complying with the terms of the 2015 deal, some of which, of course, they're no longer fulfilling. But although the French presidency was briefing journalists last night that the 7 countries had agreed that France would take the lead on this in talks with Tehran, President Donald Trump earlier this morning told journalists that he had agreed to no such thing and that the US would continue with its own outreach to Iran and indeed with its own policies, which are entirely different. The American government is applying what it calls maximum pressure on the Iranians. So it's a case in point, really, of what diplomacy means in the age of Donald Trump. The US can agree to some things and then change his mind almost overnight.
Now, Elena, there are several African countries, including South Africa, are in attendance. What do we expect the G7 to offer these African countries?
Well, for the host president, Emmanuel Macron, it's hugely important that Africa, income inequality and gender inequality are high on the agenda. That's not widely supported by everyone. The US delegation has complained that the French has put too much focus on these subjects, which Donald Trump doesn't particularly want to talk about, instead of the global economy, which the US would prefer to have on the top of the agenda. But that hasn't put off the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He did host meetings with the presidents of South Africa Africa, Burkina Faso, Rwanda, Egypt and Senegal today, and also announced a major initiative to boost women entrepreneurs in Africa. G7 countries pledged $250 million, including $135 million from France, to improve women in Africa's access to credit in an initiative that was spearheaded by the singer Angelique Kidjo, who was also here. She was saying that 2/3 of women in Africa have no access to credit, and the idea, which is going to be backed up with cash from the African Development Bank and African financial institutions, aims to help solve that problem.
And that's fantastic news. Well, then there's Donald Trump and reports of rifts forming in the G7. How is he being received, and what do you think will be his impact on the G7?
President Trump held a series of bilaterals today, including one with the new British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, on which they talked Brexit and trade tariffs. Now, of course, Johnson, along with many of his counterparts, wants to try and put pressure on the American president to try and persuade him to remove or reduce some of those tariffs that he's recently applied to China. But as they came out of that meeting, President Trump said that while he might have second thoughts about China tariffs, none of the other leaders had put any pressure on him, even though he was standing right next to the British Prime Minister, who was nodding and saying, yes, we did try and ask President Trump to cut those tariffs. The problem is that most of the leaders agree that the tariffs, the trade war between the US and China, is at least partly responsible for the economic storm clouds that saw stock markets plummet around the world in August. That analysis, of course, isn't what Donald Trump believes. He wants to talk about boosting the global economy, but won't accept that tariffs between the US and China are helping cause that plunge in the stock markets.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned Boris Johnson. Brexit and Johnson are also high on the agenda, I'm sure. How do you think Johnson will come out of the G7?
Well, he came out of perhaps his most important meeting with President Trump earlier today, all smiles. The American president said that he was the right man to do the deal, that he didn't need any advice. Of course, the American president offered a lot of unsolicited advice to Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May. And Boris Johnson told journalists that he'd told the American president a deal could be done quickly and that it would avoid privatising any part of the British health system, which is something that domestic voters want to hear. President Johnson also, Prime Minister Johnson rather, also had a one-on-one with President Ramaphosa earlier this morning. And we don't know exactly what they talked about, but I think it's very likely that a new post-Brexit trade deal between Britain and South Africa was at the top of their agenda.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that update. That was SABC correspondent Elena Casas-Montanez coming to us live from Biarritz.